explore the profound insights of Clive Staples Lewis on the nature of belief in his thought-provoking lecture. Lewis delves into the contrasting worlds of the academic researcher and the devout Christian, revealing that their approaches to faith, while seemingly divergent, share more common ground than one might expect. He challenges the notion that empirical evidence and unwavering faith are mutually exclusive, suggesting that both seekers of knowledge and holders of faith strive towards understanding in their own unique ways. Join us as we uncover the subtleties of belief through Lewis's eyes, bridging the gap between science and spirituality and fostering a deeper understanding between these two worlds.
26. On Obstinacy in Belief. A paper read to the Socratic Club and subsequently published in the Socratic Digest and in the Sewanee Review, Volume 63, Autumn in 1955. It later appeared in The World's Last Night, US 1960, and They Asked for a Paper, 1962, and is now in Screwtape Proposes a Toast, 1998. Papers have more than once been read to the Socratic Club at Oxford, in which a contrast was drawn between a supposed Christian attitude and a supposedly scientific attitude to belief. We have been told that the scientist thinks it his duty to proportion the strength of his belief exactly to the evidence, to believe less as there is less evidence, and to withdraw belief altogether when reliable adverse evidence turns up. We have been told that, on the contrary, the Christian regards it as positively praiseworthy to believe without evidence, or in excess of the evidence, or to maintain his belief unmodified in the teeth of steadily increasing evidence against it. Thus, a faith that has stood firm, which appears to mean a belief immune from all the assaults of reality, is commended. If this were a fair statement of the case, then the coexistence within the same species of such scientists and such Christians would be a very staggering phenomenon. The fact that the two classes appear to overlap, as they do, would be quite inexplicable. Certainly, all discussion between creatures so different would be hopeless. The purpose of this essay is to show that things are really not quite so bad as that. The sense in which scientists proportion their belief to the evidence and the sense in which Christians do not, both need to be defined more closely. My hope is that when this has been done, though disagreement between the two parties may remain, they will not be left staring at one another in wholly dumb and desperate incomprehension. And first, a word about belief in general. I do not see that the state of proportioning belief to evidence is anything like so common in the scientific life as has been claimed. Scientists are mainly concerned not with believing things, but with finding things out. And no one, to the best of my knowledge, uses the word believe about things he has found out. The doctor says he believes a man was poisoned before he has examined the body. After the examination, he says the man was poisoned. No one says that he believes the multiplication table. No one who catches a thief red-handed says he believes that man was stealing. The scientist, when at work, that is, when he is a scientist, is laboring to escape from belief and unbelief into knowledge. Of course, he uses hypotheses or supposals. I do not think these are beliefs. We must look, then, for the scientist's behavior about belief, not to his scientific life, but to his leisure hours. In actual modern English usage, the verb believe, except for two special usages, generally expresses a very weak degree of opinion. Where is Tom? Gone to London, I believe. The speaker would be only mildly surprised if Tom had not gone to London after all. What was the date? 430 B.C., I believe. The speaker means that he is far from sure. It is the same with the negative if it is put in the form, I believe not. Is Jones coming up this term? I believe not. But if the negative is put in a different form, then it becomes one of the special usages I mentioned a moment ago. This, of course, is the form, I don't believe it, or the still stronger, I don't believe you. I don't believe it is far stronger on the negative side than I believe is on the positive. Where is Mrs. Jones? Eloped with the butler, I believe. I don't believe it. This, especially if said with anger, may imply a conviction which, in subjective certitude, might be hard to distinguish from knowledge by experience. The other special usage is, "I believe," as uttered by a Christian. There is no great difficulty in making the hardened materialist understand, however little he approves, the sort of mental attitude which this "I believe" expresses. The materialist need only picture himself replying to some report of a miracle, "I don't believe it," and then imagine this same degree of conviction on the opposite side. He knows that he cannot, there and then, produce a refutation of the miracle which would have the certainty of mathematical demonstration. But the formal possibility that the miracle might after all have occurred does not really trouble him any more than a fear that water might not be H and O. Similarly, the Christian does not necessarily claim to have demonstrative proof, but the formal possibility that God might not exist is not necessarily present in the form of the least actual doubt. Of course, there are Christians who hold that such demonstrative proof exists, just as there may be materialists who hold that there is demonstrative disproof. But then, whichever of them is right, if either is, while he retained the proof or disproof would be not believing or disbelieving, but knowing. We are speaking of belief and disbelief in the strongest degree, but not of knowledge. Belief, in this sense, seems to me to be assent to a proposition which we think so overwhelmingly probable that there is a psychological exclusion of doubt, though not a logical exclusion of dispute. It may be asked whether belief, and of course disbelief, of this sort ever attaches to any but theological propositions. I think that many beliefs approximate to it. That is, many probabilities seem to us so strong that the absence of logical certainty does not induce in us the least shade of doubt. The scientific beliefs of those who are not themselves scientists often have this character, especially among the uneducated. Most of our beliefs about other people are of the same sort. The scientist himself, or he who was a scientist in the laboratory, has beliefs about his wife and friends which he holds, not indeed without evidence, but with more certitude than the evidence, if weighed in the laboratory manner, would justify. Most of my generation had a belief in the reality of the external world and of other people, if you prefer it, a disbelief in solipsism, far in excess of our strongest arguments. It may be true, as they now say, that the whole thing arose from category mistakes and was a pseudo-problem. But then we didn't know that in the 20s. Yet we managed to disbelieve in solipsism all the same. There is, of course, no question so far of belief without evidence. We must beware of confusion between the way in which a Christian first assents to certain propositions and the way in which he afterwards adheres to them. These must be carefully distinguished. Of the second, it is true, in a sense, to say that Christians do recommend a certain discounting of apparent contrary evidence, and I will later attempt to explain why. But so far as I know, it is not expected that a man should assent to these propositions in the first place without evidence, or in the teeth of the evidence. At any rate, if anyone expects that, I certainly do not. And in fact, the man who accepts Christianity always thinks he has good evidence, whether, like Dante, physici e metaphysici argumenti, or historical evidence, or the evidence of religious experience, or authority, or all these together. For of course authority, however we may value it in this or that particular instance, is a kind of evidence. All of our historical beliefs, most of our geographical beliefs, many of our beliefs about matter that concern us in daily life, are accepted on the authority of other human beings, whether we are Christians, atheists, scientists, or men in the street. It is not the purpose of this essay to weigh the evidence of whatever kind on which Christians base their belief. To do that would be to write a full-dress apologia. All that I need do here is to point out that, at the very worst, this evidence cannot be so weak as to warrant the view that all whom it convinces are indifferent to evidence. The history of thought seems to make this quite plain. We know, in fact, that believers are not cut off from unbelievers by any portentous inferiority of intelligence, or any perverse refusal to think. Many of them have been people of powerful minds. Many of them have been scientists. We may suppose them to have been mistaken, but we must suppose that their error was at least plausible. We might indeed conclude that it was, merely from the multitude and diversity of the arguments against it. For there is not one case against religion, but many. Some say, like Capenius in Statius, that it is a projection of our primitive fears. Primus in orbe Deus fecit timor. Others, with Euhemerus, that it is all a plant put up by wicked kings, priests, or capitalists. Others, with Tylor, that it comes from dreams about the dead. Others, with Fraser, that it is a byproduct of agriculture. Others, like Freud, that it is a complex. The moderns, that it is a category mistake. I will never believe that an error against which so many and various defensive weapons have been found necessary was, from the outset, wholly lacking in plausibility. All this post-haste and rummage in the land obviously implies a respectable enemy. There are, of course, people in our own day to whom the whole situation seems altered by the doctrine of the concealed wish. They will admit that men, otherwise apparently rational, have been deceived by the arguments for religion. But they will say that they have been deceived first by their own desires and produced the arguments afterwards as a rationalization. That these arguments have never been intrinsically even plausible, but have seemed so because they were secretly weighted by our wishes. Now, I do not doubt that this sort of thing happens in thinking about religion as in thinking about other things. But as a general explanation of religious assent, it seems to me quite useless. On that issue, our wishes may favour either side or both. The assumption that every man would be pleased, and nothing but pleased, if only he could conclude that Christianity is true, appears to me to be simply preposterous. If Freud is right about the Oedipus complex, the universal pressure of the wish that God should not exist must be enormous, and atheism must be an admirable gratification to one of our strongest suppressed impulses. This argument, in fact, could be used on the theistic side, but I have no intention of so using it. It will not really help either party. It is fatally ambivalent. Men wish on both sides. And again, there is fear fulfillment as well as wish fulfillment, and hypochondriac temperaments will always tend to think true what they most wish to be false. Thus, instead of the one predicament on which our opponents sometimes concentrate, there are in fact four. A man may be a Christian because he wants Christianity to be true. He may be an atheist because he wants atheism to be true. He may be an atheist because he wants Christianity to be true. He may be a Christian because he wants atheism to be true. Surely these possibilities cancel one another out. They may be of some use in analyzing a particular instance of belief or disbelief, where we know the case history, but as a general explanation of either they will not help us. I do not think they overthrow the view that there is evidence both for and against the Christian propositions, which fully rational minds, working honestly, can assess differently. I therefore ask you to substitute a different and less tidy picture for that with which we began. In it, you remember, two different kinds of men, scientists, who proportioned their belief to the evidence, and Christians, who did not, were left facing one another across a chasm. The picture I should prefer is like this. All men alike, on questions which interest them, escape from the region of belief into that of knowledge when they can, and if they succeed in knowing, they no longer say they believe. The questions in which mathematicians are interested admit of treatment by a particularly clear and strict technique. Those of the scientist have their own technique, which is not quite the same. Those of the historian and the judge are different again. The mathematician's proof, at least so we laymen suppose, is by reasoning, the scientist's by experiment, the historian's by documents, the judge's by concurring sworn testimony. But all these men, as men, on questions outside their own disciplines, have numerous beliefs to which they do not normally apply the methods of their own disciplines. It would indeed carry some suspicion of morbidity and even of insanity if they did. These beliefs vary in strength from weak opinion to complete subjective certitude. Specimens of such beliefs at the strongest are the Christians, "I believe," and the convinced atheists, "I don't believe a word of it." The particular subject matter on which these two disagree does not, of course, necessarily involve such strength of belief and disbelief. There are some who moderately opine that there is, or is not, a God. But there are others whose belief or disbelief is free from doubt. And all these beliefs, weak or strong, are based on what appears to the holders to be evidence. But the strong believers or disbelievers, of course, think they have very strong evidence. There is no need to suppose stark unreason on either side. We need only suppose error. One side has estimated the evidence wrongly. And even so, the mistake cannot be supposed to be of a flagrant nature. Otherwise the debate would not continue. So much, then, for the way in which Christians come to assent to certain propositions. But we have now to consider something quite different, their adherence to their belief after it has once been formed. It is here that the charge of irrationality and resistance to evidence becomes really important. For it must be admitted at once that Christians do praise such an adherence as if it were meritorious, and even, in a sense, more meritorious the stronger the apparent evidence against their faith becomes. They even warn one another that such apparent contrary evidence, such trials to faith or temptations to doubt, may be expected to occur, and determine in advance to resist them. And this is certainly shockingly unlike the behaviour we all demand of the scientist or the historian in their own disciplines. There, to slur over or ignore the faintest evidence against a favourite hypothesis is admittedly foolish and shameful. It must be exposed to every test, every doubt must be invited. But then, I do not admit that a hypothesis is a belief. And if we consider the scientist not among his hypotheses in the laboratory, but among the beliefs in his ordinary life, I think the contrast between him and the Christian would be weakened. If, for the first time, a doubt of his wife's fidelity crosses the scientist's mind, does he consider it his duty at once to entertain this doubt with complete impartiality, at once to evolve a series of experiments by which it can be tested, and to await the result with pure neutrality of mind? No doubt it may come to that in the end. There are unfaithful wives. There are experimental husbands. But is such a course what his brother scientists would recommend to him, all of them, I suppose, except one, as the first step he should take, and the only one consistent with his honour as a scientist? Or would they, like us, blame him for a moral flaw, rather than praise him for an intellectual virtue if he did so? This is intended, however, merely as a precaution against exaggerating the difference between Christian obstinacy in belief and the behaviour of normal people about their non-theological beliefs. I am far from suggesting that the case I have supposed is exactly parallel to the Christian obstinacy. For, of course, evidence of the wife's infidelity might accumulate, and presently reach a point at which the scientist would be pitiably foolish to disbelieve it. But the Christians seem to praise an adherence to the original belief which holds out against any evidence whatever. I must now try to show why such praise is, in fact, a logical conclusion from the original belief itself. This can be done best by thinking for a moment of situations in which the thing is reversed. In Christianity, such faith is demanded of us, but there are situations in which we demand it of others. There are times when we can do all that a fellow creature needs, if only he will trust us. In getting a dog out of a trap, in extracting a thorn from a child's finger, in teaching a boy to swim or rescuing one who can't, in getting a frightened beginner over a nasty place on a mountain, the one fatal obstacle may be their distrust. We are asking them to trust us in the teeth of their senses, their imagination, and their intelligence. We ask them to believe that what is painful will relieve their pain, and that what looks dangerous is their only safety. We ask them to accept apparent impossibilities, that moving the paw further back into the trap is the way to get it out, that hurting the finger very much more will stop the finger hurting, that water, which is obviously permeable, will resist and support the body, that holding on to the only support within reach is not the way to avoid sinking, that to go higher and onto a more exposed ledge is the way not to fall. To support all these incredibilia, we can rely only on the other party's confidence in us. A confidence certainly not based on demonstration, admittedly shot through with emotion, and perhaps, if we are strangers, resting on nothing but such assurance as the look of our face and the tone of our voice can supply, or even, for the dog, on our smell. Sometimes, because of their unbelief, we can do no mighty works. But if we succeed, we do so because they have maintained their faith in us against apparently contrary evidence. No one blames us for demanding such faith. No one blames them for giving it. No one says afterwards, what an unintelligent dog or child or boy that must have been to trust us. If the young mountaineer were a scientist, it would not be held against him, when he came up for a fellowship, that he had once departed from Clifford's rule of evidence by entertaining a belief with strength greater than the evidence logically obliged him to. Now, to accept the Christian propositions is, ipso facto, to believe that we are to God always as that dog or child or bather or mountain climber was to us, only very much more so. From this, it is a strictly logical conclusion that the behavior which was appropriate to them will be appropriate to us, only very much more so. Mark, I am not saying that the strength of our original belief must, by psychological necessity, produce such behavior. I am saying that the content of our original belief, by logical necessity, entails the proposition that such behavior is appropriate. If human life is, in fact, ordered by a beneficent being, whose knowledge of our real needs and of the way in which they can be satisfied infinitely exceeds our own, we must expect, a priori, that his operations will often appear to us far from beneficent and far from wise, and that it will be our highest prudence to give him our confidence in spite of this. This expectation is increased by the fact that when we accept Christianity, we are warned that apparent evidence against it will occur, evidence strong enough to deceive, if possible, the very elect. Our situation is rendered tolerable by two facts. One is that we seem to ourselves, besides the apparently contrary evidence, to receive favourable evidence. Some of it is in the form of external events, as when I go to see a man, moved by what I felt to be a whim, and find he has been praying that I should come to him that day. Some of it is more like the evidence on which the mountaineer or the dog might trust his rescuer. The rescuer's voice, look, and smell. For it seems to us, though you and your premises must believe us deluded, that we have something like a knowledge by acquaintance of the person we believe in, however imperfect and intermittent it may be. We trust not because a God exists, but because this God exists. Or if we ourselves dare not claim to know him, Christendom does, and we trust at least some of its representatives in the same way, because of the sort of people they are. The second fact is this. We think we can see already why, if our original belief is true, such trust beyond the evidence against much apparent evidence has to be demanded of us. For the question is not about being helped out of one trap, or over one difficult place in a climb. We believe that his intention is to create a certain personal relation between himself and us, a relation really sui generis, but analogically describable in terms of filial or of erotic love. Complete trust is an ingredient in that relation, such trust as could have no room to grow except where there is also room for doubt. To love involves trusting the beloved beyond the evidence, even against much evidence. No man is our friend who believes in our good intentions only when they are proved. No man is our friend who will not be very slow to accept evidence against them. Such confidence between one man and another is in fact almost universally praised as a moral beauty, not blamed as a logical error. And the suspicious man is blamed for a meanness of character, not admired for the excellence of his logic. There is, you see, no real parallel between Christian obstinacy and faith and the obstinacy of a bad scientist trying to preserve a hypothesis although the evidence has turned against it. Unbelievers very pardonably get the impression that an adherence to our faith is like that, because they meet Christianity, if at all, mainly in apologetic works. And there, of course, the existence and beneficence of God must appear as a speculative question like any other. Indeed, it is a speculative question as long as it is a question at all. But once it has been answered in the affirmative, you get quite a new situation. To believe that God, at least this God, exists, is to believe that you, as a person, now stand in the presence of God as a person. What would, a moment before, have been variations in opinion, now becomes variations in your personal attitude to a person. You are no longer faced with an argument which demands your assent, but with a person who demands your confidence. A faint analogy would be this. It is one thing to discuss in vacuo whether so-and-so will join us tonight, and another to discuss this when so-and-so's honour is pledged to come and some great matter depends on his coming. In the first case, it would be merely reasonable, as the clock ticked on, to expect him less and less. In the second, a continued expectation far into the night would be due to our friend's character if we had found him reliable before. Which of us would not feel slightly ashamed if 1 moment after we had given him up he arrived with a full explanation of his delay? We should feel that we ought to have known him better. Now, of course, we see, quite as clearly as you, how agonizingly two-edged all this is. A faith of this sort, if it happens to be true, is obviously what we need, and it is infinitely ruinous to lack it. But there can be faith of this sort where it is wholly ungrounded. The dog may lick the face of the man who comes to take it out of the trap, but the man may only mean to vivisect it in South Park's Road when he has done so. The ducks who come to the call, "Dilly, dilly, come and be killed," have confidence in the farmer's wife, and she wrings their necks for their pains. There is that famous French story of the fire in the theatre. Panic was spreading. The spectators were just turning from an audience into a mob. At that moment, a huge bearded man leaped through the orchestra onto the stage, raised his hand with a gesture full of nobility, and cried, "Que chacun regagne sa place." Such was the authority of his voice and bearing that everyone obeyed him. As a result, they were all burned to death, while the bearded man walked quietly out through the wings to the stage door, took a cab which was waiting for someone else, and went home to bed. That demand for our confidence which a true friend makes of us is exactly the same that a confidence trickster would make. That refusal to trust, which is sensible in reply to a confidence trickster, is ungenerous and ignoble to a friend, and deeply damaging to our relation with him. To be forewarned, and therefore forearmed against apparently contrary appearance, is eminently rational if our belief is true. But if our belief is a delusion, this same forewarning and forearming would obviously be the method whereby the delusion rendered itself incurable. And yet again, to be aware of these possibilities and still to reject them is clearly the precise mode and the only mode in which our personal response to God can establish itself. In that sense, the ambiguity is not something that conflicts with faith so much as a condition which makes faith possible. When you are asked for trust, you may give it or withhold it. It is senseless to say that you will trust if you are given demonstrative certainty. There would be no room for trust if demonstration were given. When demonstration is given, what will be left will be simply the sort of relation which results from having trusted or not having trusted before it was given. The saying, "Blessed are those that have not seen and have believed," has nothing to do with our original assent to the Christian propositions. It was not addressed to a philosopher inquiring whether God exists. It was addressed to a man who already believed that, who already had long acquaintance with a particular person, and evidence that that person could do very odd things, and who then refused to believe one odd thing more, often predicted by that person and vouched for by all his closest friends. It is a rebuke not to skepticism in the philosophic sense, but to the psychological quality of being suspicious. It says, in effect, "You should have known me better." There are cases between man and man where we should all, in our different way, bless those who have not seen and have believed. Our relation to those who trusted us only after we were proved innocent in court cannot be the same as our relation to those who trusted us all through. Our opponents, then, have a perfect right to dispute with us about the grounds of our original assent, but they must not accuse us of sheer insanity if, after the assent has been given, our adherence to it is no longer proportioned to every fluctuation of the apparent evidence. They cannot, of course, be expected to know on what our assurance feeds, and how it revives, and is always rising from its ashes. They cannot be expected to see how the quality of the object which we think we are beginning to know by acquaintance drives us to the view that if this were a delusion, then we should have to say that the universe had produced no real thing of comparable value, and that all explanations of the delusion seemed somehow less important than the thing explained. That is knowledge we cannot communicate. But they can see how the ascent of necessity moves us from the logic of speculative thought into what might perhaps be called the logic of personal relations. What would, up till then, have been variations simply of opinion, become variations of conduct by a person to a person. Credere Deum esse turns into credere in Deum, and Deum here is this God, the increasingly knowable Lord.